Hello, welcome to Know About History channel. Hope you like it.
The Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft carrier Akagi stood as the formidable centerpiece of the Kido Butai, the first air fleet, which had revolutionized naval warfare across the Pacific in the early months of the Second World War. To understand the secrets behind its sinking at the Battle of Midway, one must first appreciate the Akagi not merely as a ship but as a technological and doctrinal symbol of Japanese naval ambition. Originally laid down as an Amagi-class battlecruiser, the Akagi was converted to an aircraft carrier under the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty. This transition from a vessel designed for heavy surface engagement to one designed for the projection of air power created a unique and somewhat idiosyncratic platform. Its massive hull, designed for high-speed pursuit, made it one of the fastest and largest carriers in the world, yet its internal configuration remained a complex maze of hangars and workshops that would ultimately prove fatal. The triple flight deck configuration of its early years, though later replaced by a single full-length deck, left a legacy of unusual funnel placement and ventilation issues. By June 1942, Akagi was the flagship of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, carrying the weight of the Empire's expectations. The secrets of its demise are often buried under the popular myth of the fatal 5 minutes, a narrative that suggested the Japanese were just seconds away from launching a massive counterstrike when American dive bombers arrived. However, modern historical analysis, most notably the groundbreaking work of Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, reveals a far more complex reality rooted in operational doctrine, damage control failures, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the carrier's internal vulnerabilities. The strategic backdrop was the Mi operation, Yamamoto's grand plan to draw out and destroy the remnants of the United States Pacific Fleet by invading the Midway Atoll. The Japanese believed they held the element of surprise, unaware that American cryptanalysts at Station Hypo had broken the JN-25B code and were reading the Kido Butai's movements like an open book. This intelligence gap was the first and perhaps most significant secret to the Akagi's doom. While Nagumo sailed toward Midway expecting a clean sweep of the island's defenses before a potential engagement with American carriers, Admiral Chester Nimitz had already positioned 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, to the northeast in an area known as Point Luck. The tactical situation on the morning of June 4, 1942, was defined by a series of high-stakes decisions that exposed the Akagi's structural weaknesses. The Japanese doctrine favored the launch of massive, coordinated strikes involving all 4 carriers of the Kido Butai. This required long periods of flight deck activity, during which the ships were highly vulnerable. When the first strike on Midway Island returned, Nagumo faced the dilemma of whether to rearm his reserve aircraft, which were currently equipped with torpedoes for a naval engagement, with land attack bombs to finish off the Midway airfield. This decision-making process was hampered by the lack of effective reconnaissance. The secret failure of the Japanese scouting plan, particularly the delay of the heavy cruiser Tone's No. 4 scout plane, left Nagumo blind to the presence of the American task forces. When the Tone scout finally spotted the American ships, the Akagi became a hive of frantic activity. The order to rearm, swapping bombs back for torpedoes, created a chaotic and lethal environment on the hangar decks. Unlike American carriers, which were designed with open hangars to allow for ventilation and the easy jettisoning of damaged aircraft or ordnance, Japanese carriers like the Akagi had enclosed, 2-level hangars. This design was intended to protect aircraft from the elements of the North Pacific, but it effectively turned the hangar spaces into pressure cookers. In the rush to rearm, discarded bombs and torpedoes were not properly returned to their armored magazines but were instead left stacked in the hangars, alongside fueled aircraft and oxygen-rich aviation spirit lines. This was the hidden vulnerability that would transform a single bomb hit into a catastrophic loss. The American attack began in waves, initially consisting of torpedo bombers that were slaughtered by the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, CAP. The Zero fighters of the Akagi and its sister ships were peerless in low-altitude dogfights, and they successfully drove the TBD Devastators into the sea. However, this success was a double-edged sword. To intercept the low-flying torpedo bombers, the Zeros were pulled down to sea level, leaving the skies at higher altitudes unguarded. This was not a failure of individual pilots but a systemic failure of the CAP coordination. There was no radar-directed intercept system on the Akagi, and communication between ships was primarily conducted via visual signals or short-range radio, which was often overwhelmed during combat. At approximately 10:22 a.m., the true secret of the Akagi's fate descended from the sun in the form of SPD Dauntless dive bombers from the USS Enterprise. The attack was led by Lieutenant Commander Richard "Dick" Best. While most of the American bombers focused on the Kaga, Best and two wingmen realized the Akagi was wide open. They executed a near-perfect vertical dive. To the observers on the Akagi's bridge, the arrival of the dive bombers was a sudden, terrifying revelation. The ship was in the middle of a turn, its massive wake carving a white arc in the blue water, as Best's bomb struck. Contrary to the long-held belief that multiple bombs hit the Akagi, historical forensics and survivor testimonies confirm that only one bomb actually struck the ship, while a second was a near miss that damaged the rudder. But that one bomb was enough. It did not strike the flight deck with the intent of sinking the ship through sheer kinetic force. Instead, it penetrated the flight deck near the midship elevator and exploded in the upper hangar. This was the precise location where the fueled and armed B-5N2 Kate torpedo bombers were parked. The explosion set off a chain reaction of the improperly stored ordnance and the gasoline-filled fuel lines. The secret of the Akagi's sinking is that the ship was essentially destroyed from the inside out by its own weaponry. The enclosed hangars trapped the blast pressure, blowing out the sides of the ship and preventing the crew from reaching the fires. The Japanese damage control philosophy was another hidden factor. Unlike the Americans, who utilized specialized damage control teams and emphasized the importance of every sailor being trained in firefighting, the Japanese Navy relied on professional engineering crews. When these specialists were killed or trapped by the initial blast, the remaining crew lacked the training and equipment to contain the inferno. The fire mains on the Akagi were severed almost immediately, and the carbon dioxide suppression systems were ineffective against the massive chemical fires fueled by aviation gasoline and high explosives. The struggle to save the Akagi lasted for several hours, but the situation was hopeless. Admiral Nagumo was forced to transfer his flag to the light cruiser Nagara, a move that symbolized the decapitation of the Kido Butai's command. The ship became a drifting torch, its engines eventually failing as the fires spread to the boiler rooms. The psychological impact on the crew and the Japanese high command was profound. Akagi was the pride of the fleet, the ship that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. To see it reduced to a burning wreck by a single bomb was a shock that many could not reconcile. Another secret aspect of the sinking involves the role of the Japanese destroyers in the final hours. Yamamoto, still hoping for a night engagement to salvage the battle, was reluctant to scuttle the carrier. However, by the morning of June 5, it was clear the Akagi could not be saved and could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. The order was given to the destroyers of the 4th Destroyer Division to sink the flagship with torpedoes. This was a moment of deep ritualistic sorrow for the Japanese Navy. The Akagi slipped beneath the waves at 5:20 a.m., taking with it 267 of its crew. The loss of the Akagi, along with the Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, was the definitive turning point of the war, yet the Japanese government kept the sinking a secret from the public for years, referring to the Midway Victory in propaganda. The discovery of the Akagi's wreck in 2019 by the research vessel Petrel, operated by Vulcan Inc., added a new layer of scientific understanding to the secrets of its sinking. The wreck lies more than 17,000 feet deep in the Papahana-Mokuakia Marine National Monument. The high-resolution sonar imagery and ROV footage revealed that the ship sits upright on the seafloor, but its flight deck is largely gone, incinerated by the fires or collapsed by the pressure of the descent. The hull remains largely intact, showing the incredible structural strength of the original battlecruiser design, but the catastrophic damage to the midship hangar area is clearly visible. This physical evidence corroborates the one bomb theory and illustrates the sheer violence of the internal explosions. The secrets of the Akagi also extend to the human element, the stories of the pilots who never flew and the mechanics who died in the hangars. Many of these men were the most experienced naval aviation personnel in the world, and their loss was a blow from which the IJN never recovered. The Akagi's sinking was not just a loss of a ship, it was the loss of an entire era of Japanese naval dominance. The doctrinal errors, the intelligence failures, and the technical vulnerabilities that led to its destruction were systemic issues that the Japanese military was unable to rectify as the war progressed. The Battle of Midway and the sinking of the Akagi taught the world that in the age of the carrier, the ship that strikes first and understands its own internal weaknesses is the ship that survives. The Akagi, in its final moments, was a victim of its own success, blinded by hubris and destroyed by the very power it sought to project. The silence of its wreck at the bottom of the Pacific is a haunting reminder of the fragility of even the mightiest instruments of war when faced with a determined and well-informed opponent. Expanding on the technical aspects of the Akagi's design helps illuminate why it was so susceptible to a single point of failure. The conversion from a battlecruiser meant that the ship's center of gravity was higher than that of a purpose-built carrier, and its hangar decks were essentially additions to a hull meant for heavy guns. The fuel storage systems were located deep within the ship, but the lines that carried the volatile 92-octane aviation gasoline were prone to leaking under the vibration of high-speed travel or the shock of near misses. On the morning of June 4, these lines were primed and pressurized. When the bomb from Dick Best hit, the resulting vapor cloud explosion was likely what caused the most immediate and irreparable damage. The secret of the death of the Akagi lies in this intersection of chemical volatility and architectural confinement. Furthermore, the Japanese decision to keep their aircraft in the hangars until the very last moment of launch, a contrast to the American practice of warming up engines on the flight deck, meant that the hangars were filled with idling engines and the smell of fuel. This hot hangar environment was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The organizational secrets of the Kido Butai also played a role. Admiral Nagumo is often criticized for his indecision, but he was operating within a rigid command structure that discouraged initiative. The secret of the Midway defeat was partly the lack of a flexible Plan B. The Japanese had become so accustomed to the decisive battle doctrine that they struggled to adapt when the battle turned into a series of disjointed, chaotic skirmishes. The loss of the Akagi was also a failure of the escorting ships. The Japanese destroyers and cruisers were positioned in a screen that was too far from the carriers to provide effective anti-aircraft fire. They were also focused on the threat of submarines, as the USS Nautilus had been hounding the fleet throughout the morning. In fact, it was the hunt for the Nautilus that led the destroyer Arashi to steam back toward the fleet at high speed, inadvertently creating a white arrow in the water that guided the American dive bombers directly to the carriers. This accidental clue was perhaps the most ironic secret of the entire battle. In the decades following the war, the narrative of the Akagi's sinking was often colored by the memoirs of Mitsuo Fuchida, the strike leader of the Pearl Harbor attack. Fuchida's account, which claimed the decks were packed with planes ready to take off, was the primary source for historians for over 50 years. The secret he kept, perhaps out of a desire to preserve the honor of the Navy, was that the Japanese were nowhere near launching. The shattered sword analysis proved that the Akagi was actually in the middle of clearing its deck and cycling its cap when it was hit. This revelation changes our understanding of the battle from one of bad luck for the Japanese to one of operational failure. The Akagi was caught in the middle of its most complex logistical maneuver, and it was the Americans' ability to capitalize on that moment of vulnerability that won the day. The sinking of the Akagi remains a masterclass in the importance of tempo, intelligence, and the often overlooked details of ship construction and damage control. It is a story of a giant brought low not by a greater giant, but by its own weight and the precision of a few determined men in the cockpit of a dive bomber. The legacy of the Akagi is a cautionary tale about the dangers of technical and tactical rigidity in an ever-evolving theater of war. The ship that once reigned supreme over the Pacific now rests in total darkness, its secrets finally laid bare by the light of modern scholarship and the unblinking eye of undersea technology. The deeper layers of the Akagi's operational history reveal that the ship's very name, meaning Red Castle, alluded to a sense of permanence that proved illusory. During its years of service, the carrier had undergone significant modifications that were intended to increase its lethality but often complicated its survival. For instance, the original design included two lower flight decks that were supposed to allow aircraft to launch directly from the hangars while the top deck was used for landings. This was a secret attempt to maximize the launch-to-recover cycle, but as aircraft became larger and heavier, the lower decks became obsolete and were eventually enclosed. This enclosure, while necessary for modern aviation, created the very dead zones in ventilation that exacerbated the fire hazards during the Battle of Midway. The ship's funnel system was also a point of engineering curiosity. To keep smoke away from the flight deck, the Akagi had a large funnel that curved downward toward the sea. While this was effective for flight operations, it created a suction effect that pulled smoke and heat back into the lower decks during the fire, further asphyxiating the damage control teams. These minor design choices, made years before the war, converged on that single morning in June 1942 to seal the carrier's fate. The human secrets within the Akagi were equally compelling. The relationship between Admiral Nagumo and his air staff officer, Minoru Genda, was one of tension and brilliance. Genda was the architect of the multi-carrier strike, but on the day of the battle, he was suffering from a debilitating bout of pneumonia. He was often confined to his cabin, and his absence from the bridge meant that the most innovative mind in the Japanese Naval Air Service was not at the helm when the critical decisions regarding rearming were made. Had Genda been fully active, the secret of the Japanese response might have been different. He might have advocated for a more aggressive, if risky, launch of half-armed planes. Instead, Nagumo's cautious adherence to doctrine prevailed, leading to the delay that proved fatal. Furthermore, the social structure of the IJN, which maintained a strict and often brutal hierarchy, hindered the flow of information from the lookouts and the hangar deck to the command level. Junior officers were hesitant to report problems or contradictions to their superiors, a cultural secret that significantly slowed the ship's reaction time to the approaching American threat. Another overlooked secret is the role of the Japanese fuel. The IJN used a specific type of unrefined or crude petroleum from the Dutch East Indies in some of its ships, which was highly volatile and produced thick, black, oily smoke that was nearly impossible to extinguish with standard water-based systems. While the Akagi was ostensibly running on refined fuel, the presence of various oils and lubricants in the hangars meant that once the fire started, it became a self-sustaining furnace. The thermal intensity of the fires was so great that it actually began to melt the aluminum components of the aircraft stored on the hangar decks, creating molten rivers of metal that spread the fire into the lower reaches of the ship. This was confirmed by the 2019 ROV survey, which noted significant evidence of extreme heat distortion in the midsection of the hull. The sinking was not a slow intake of water through a hole in the hull, but a total structural collapse caused by the heat of the interior fires weakening the steel frames until they could no longer support the weight of the ship. The strategic secrecy following the battle was also unprecedented. The surviving crew members of the Akagi and the other sunken carriers were quarantined upon their return to Japan. They were kept in isolated naval bases and forbidden from speaking to their families or the public about the disaster. This was a state secret of the highest order, as the loss of the 4 carriers effectively ended Japan's offensive capabilities in the Pacific. By keeping the sinking hidden, the Japanese High Command was able to maintain the illusion of strength, but this also meant that the hard-won lessons of Midway, especially regarding damage control and the vulnerability of carriers, were not shared with the rest of the fleet. The secrets of the Akagi's death were buried so deeply that the Japanese Navy continued to make similar mistakes in later battles, such as the Battle of the Philippine Sea. In the final analysis, the sinking of the Akagi was the result of a perfect storm of technological, tactical, and cultural factors. It was a secret failure of a great power to understand the changing nature of the tools it had created. The carrier, which had been designed as a tool of aggression, was fundamentally unprepared for a defensive struggle. The precision of the American dive bombers was the catalyst, but the fuel was provided by the Akagi itself. The ship's death remains a poignant study in how the very attributes that make a weapon powerful, its size, its speed, its concentrated firepower, can also be its greatest liabilities. The Akagi's resting place at the bottom of the Pacific serves as a memorial to the thousands of men who served on her and a silent witness to the end of the carrier supremacy of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The secrets of Midway continue to be unraveled by historians and scientists, but the core lesson remains. In the brutal reality of naval warfare, there is no such thing as an unsinkable ship, and even a red castle can be turned into a tomb by a single, well-placed blow. The discovery of the wreck ensures that the Akagi will not be forgotten, but it also serves to demystify the legends, replacing them with a stark, haunting reality of steel, fire, and the immense weight of the deep ocean. The logistics of the Japanese air groups on the Akagi also reveal hidden flaws that contributed to the disaster. Unlike the American carriers, which were beginning to experiment with larger air groups and more flexible deck load strikes, the Akagi's air group was a rigid organization. Each pilot was a specialist, trained to a level of perfection that made them irreplaceable. The secret cost of the Akagi's sinking was the loss of these elite aircrews, not just those who went down with the ship, but those who were forced to ditch in the ocean when their home was destroyed. These pilots were the secret weapon of the Japanese Empire, and they were spent in a single morning. The replacement pilots who followed in the later years of the war would never reach the same level of proficiency, a demographic shift that ensured Japan's eventual defeat. The Akagi's hangar management was also governed by a secret of space saving. The Japanese utilized a folding wing mechanism on their planes, but the maintenance of these mechanisms was labor-intensive and occurred in the cramped, poorly lit conditions of the lower hangars. When the fires broke out, these maintenance areas became death traps. The role of the Japanese radar, or rather the lack thereof, is another critical secret. While the Japanese had developed rudimentary radar technology, it was not installed on the Akagi at the time of Midway. They relied entirely on human lookouts, whose effectiveness was limited by fatigue, glare, and the sheer speed of modern dive bombers. The American secret was the CXAM radar, which gave them a significant advantage in situational awareness. This technological disparity meant that the Akagi was fighting a 20th-century war with 19th-century eyes. The secrets from the Battle of Midway are often framed as a series of fortunate events for the Americans, but when one looks at the details of the Akagi's loss, it becomes clear that it was a victory of modernization and systems thinking over tradition and individual heroism. The Akagi was a magnificent artifact of a bygone era of naval thought, beautiful and lethal, but ultimately too fragile for the firestorm it had helped to ignite. The ship's final plunge into the abyss was the end of a long, hidden trajectory of decline that had begun the moment it left the shipyards of Kerr. Every bolt, every fuel line, and every command decision had been leading to that moment in the Central Pacific where the Red Castle finally crumbled. The environmental conditions on that June morning also played a secret role. A thin layer of clouds provided intermittent cover for the American planes, allowing them to approach the Japanese fleet with less risk of early detection. This weather secret was a variable that Nagumo could not control, yet it favored the attacker. The sea state was calm, which paradoxically made the wakes of the Japanese ships more visible from the air, guiding the bombers with mathematical precision. The Akagi's turn into the wind, intended to facilitate the launch of its own planes, actually stabilized the ship for the dive bombers, making it an easier target during those critical seconds of the dive. These microscopic details of time and place are the true secrets of history, the small, seemingly insignificant factors that, when combined, change the fate of nations. The sinking of the Akagi was a tragedy of errors, a symphony of destruction that played out in the silence of the vast ocean. As researchers continue to study the site and the historical records, new secrets may emerge, perhaps regarding the exact state of the engines or the last messages sent from the bridge, but the overarching narrative remains one of a mighty power undone by its own internal contradictions. The Akagi is now a part of the seabed, its steel returning to the earth, but its story remains a vital chapter in the understanding of how wars are won and lost on the razor's edge of chance and preparation. To further analyze the Akagi's destruction, one must look at the specific chemistry of its fire suppression systems. The Japanese used a foam-based system that was supposed to be effective against oil fires, but the secret failure was in the delivery mechanism. The pipes for the foam were located in the ceilings of the hangars, which were the first things to be warped and destroyed by the heat of the initial explosions. Once the delivery system was compromised, the sailors were left to fight the fires with handheld extinguishers and buckets, which were laughable against the thousands of gallons of burning gasoline. This lack of redundancy in critical systems was a secret flaw common to many Japanese naval designs of the era. They prioritized speed and offensive power over survivability, a philosophy that worked as long as they were winning but was catastrophic when they were hit. The American carriers, particularly after the lessons of the Coral Sea, had developed much more robust and redundant firefighting systems, which allowed the Yorktown to survive multiple hits that would have sunk the Akagi. The final secrets of the Akagi are perhaps the most personal, the journals and letters of the men who served on her, many of which remain in private collections in Japan. These documents speak of a deep sense of foreboding that existed even before the battle began. Some officers felt that the Midway plan was too complex and relied too much on the enemy doing exactly what was expected. This internal dissent was a secret that never reached the ears of Yamamoto or the Emperor, but it existed within the corridors of the Red Castle. The Akagi was a ship of secrets from its conception to its watery grave. It was a ship that tried to be two things at once, a battlecruiser and a carrier, and in the end, it was neither. It was simply a target. The legacy of its sinking is the legacy of the Pacific War itself, a transition from the old world of surface combat to the new world of aerial supremacy, a transition that was paid for in the blood of those who lived and died on the decks of the Akagi. The silence of the deep Pacific is the only thing that remains of its once mighty engines, but the lessons of its demise continue to echo through military history, reminding every generation that the greatest secrets are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when they will decide the outcome of the battle. The discovery of the Akagi's final resting place also highlighted the secret of the ship's final moments of buoyancy. For decades, it was unclear why the Akagi stayed afloat for so long after being abandoned. The ROV footage showed that the ship's lower hull remained watertight, even as the upper structures were incinerated. This was a testament to the battlecruiser armor belt, which protected the vitals from external damage. The secret of its long, slow death was that the vitals were safe, but the brain and nerves, the command centers and communication lines, were destroyed. The ship was alive but brain dead, drifting aimlessly as the fires slowly consumed its heart. This prolonged agony only added to the tragedy for the Japanese, as they had to watch their flagship burn for an entire night before finally ending its suffering. The torpedoes from the Urashi, Hagakaze, Maikaze, and Noaki were the final secrets, the merciful coup de grace that sent the Akagi to the bottom. In the end, the Akagi was a ship that refused to die easily, a stubborn remnant of a naval tradition that was being systematically dismantled by the reality of modern war. The secrets of the Akagi are the secrets of Midway, and the secrets of Midway are the secrets of how the world was changed in a single, terrifying day in June 1942. The ship now lies in peace, far from the fires and the screams, a silent monument to the high cost of empire and the enduring power of the sea to keep its secrets until we are ready to find them. The geopolitical secrets tied to the Akagi's service also involve the secret negotiations and tactical theories of the 1930s. The Japanese had secretly practiced the multi-carrier doctrine in remote bays, far from the eyes of Western observers. They had perfected the massed airstrike, which was the secret behind the success at Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean. However, this very massing of carriers, placing 4 of the 6 fleet carriers in a single formation, was the secret risk that Nimitz exploited. By putting all their eggs in one basket, the Japanese gave the Americans the opportunity to win the war in a single morning. This concentration of force was both the secret of Japanese strength and the secret of their catastrophic vulnerability. The sinking of the Akagi was the inevitable result of this high-risk, high-reward strategy. When the reward failed to materialize, the risk was all that remained. In the final reckoning, the Akagi's story is one of transition and consequence. The secret of its design was its battlecruiser soul. The secret of its operation was its elite aircrew. The secret of its destruction was its own fuel and bombs. Each layer of its history reveals a piece of the puzzle that was the Pacific War. As we look at the high-resolution images of its wreck today, we are not just looking at a sunken ship, we are looking at the end of an ideology. The Red Castle has fallen, and in its place, a new world of naval aviation was born, one that valued radar, damage control, and flexibility above the rigid perfection of the past. The secrets of the Akagi are finally out in the open, and they tell a story of human courage, technical failure, and the relentless, unforgiving nature of war on the high seas. The Akagi's journey from the shipyards of Kure to the depths of Midway is a path of fire and water, a journey that defined the 20th century and continues to fascinate those who seek to understand the true price of power. The ship's silence is now its most powerful message, a secret whispered by the currents of the deep ocean to anyone who will listen. As the years pass, the Akagi will continue to deteriorate, the sea slowly reclaiming the steel that once challenged the world. But the secrets revealed by its sinking, the importance of the OODA loop, the necessity of integrated defense, the danger of enclosed hangars, and the absolute power of intelligence, will remain as relevant as ever. The Akagi was a teacher in its death, providing a brutal lesson that would shape the future of every navy on Earth. The fatal 5 minutes may have been a myth, but the fatal system was very real. And that is the ultimate secret of the Akagi, that no matter how big the ship or how brave the crew, it is the system that wins or loses the battle. The Akagi lost because its system failed, and in that failure, the course of history was forever changed. The Red Castle is now a castle of shadows, but its light still shines through the pages of history, illuminating the dark corners of the Pacific War and the secrets that were buried with it.